It's time to start creating the views that allow us to edit the information. So far we've been looking at information, and that's nice and we need it, but we also need to be able to retrieve that information and allow it to edit, maybe for deletes, inserts, or saves. We've put a good pattern in place using the data context as our unit of work and then these repositories for our sessions and attendees and speakers. We're going to take advantage of that in this module as we build out the editing screens. In fact, we'll be using this repository pattern throughout the rest of this course. So we'll take some screens that allow us to show data, like a list of sessions, and then show how we can actually open up an editing screen and then save that information. But first, what are we going to cover? Well, in this module, we're going to show you can navigate from a list to the details and talk about how you can get the full details as opposed to the partials. And this will include the HTML and the directives that we need to use to bind the data from the controllers up to the views. Let's take a look ahead at the next module where we're going to cover building on this to put in the save and the cancel, taking advantage of the repository pattern and Breeze, and also add in change detection and some animations for some visual cues for change tracking. And then after that, we're going to cover how you can use cache data for things like lookup lists and dropdowns, because when we get to dealing with the sessions that have dropdowns and related data. So in this module, we're going to build up the editing for the speakers page and handle all the navigation, the routing, and the passing of the parameters, and then loading all the details for that speaker information. The first step in creating an editing scenario is to have a page to go to. So we have to be able to get from, in this case, the speakers list, over to a new page, which could be the speaker details. So we'll begin by creating this new page and its controller, and then handling the logic to go from the list over to the details using routing. Our first task is to be able to go from the speaker screen all the way to speaker details. So here, if we select a speaker like Aaron Sconard and we click on this, we want to happen is go over to a new page and use routing to get there, so we open up the details for Aaron Sconard. Well, that's not in place yet, so let's go do that. First, we'll go down into the speaker folder and we'll create a new HTML file here. We'll come up and we'll say add new. We'll choose HTML page and we'll choose speaker details as the name. And let's just copy and paste the speaker's HTML, and then we'll call it speaker detail. Now, because we don't actually want it to be exactly the same HTML, let's go inside here and edit it. In fact, let's go ahead and get rid of everything inside of this container fluid. And we don't want any of this, so therefore we just have basically an empty item here. And we're going to want a controller to be called speaker detail, so we change that in the ng controller directive. So next we have the controller in place, so we'll go up into add new item, and we'll use the sidewall templates to create a controller using the controller as syntax, and we'll name this controller speaker detail. And we'll get rid of some of the comments just to trim it up. And when this particular controller gets loaded, we want to use our feature, which is the common.activate controller, and that's going to be in the dependency called common. And we've used this before in the other controllers. And what this is going to do is, after the controller is activated, it's going to turn off the spinner. And for now, just to make sure we got to this page and it worked, we'll leave the title in place. We're not going to use that later. We'll put it down here inside the HTML. So at least now when we navigate to this page, we should see something in here. And that something should be the title, which would be speaker detail. Now we have a view, but we have no way of getting there. So that's kind of important. Let's go back into the speakers HTML. And this is going to be the page that is going to have the list of speakers. So we want to put an event on here when they select a speaker to go to the other page. Now let's make some more room. We're going to scroll down here, and this is actually the list. That's the ng repeat where we're going to list out all the speakers. So right here, let's put a directive on here for ng click. So when we click on this, what do we want to do? Well, let's call a method called goToSpeaker. And we'll pass in s, which happens to be the speaker they clicked on, right here in the ng repeat. And we'll put a little HTML in here to make sure that people know when they hover over that item that's going to be going to the speaker details. That's all we need to do to the view, but we also have a controller for speakers, and we have to create that method for goToSpeakers. So first we'll scroll down and add the method right here. We'll expose it. And then we want to add that method. I like to keep things alphabetical, so we'll do that down here under getSpeaker. We'll create a function called goToSpeaker. We're going to be passing in that s from the view, which is going to be the speaker. And we'll make sure we have a speaker, just in case, and make sure the speaker has an ID. And if so, what we're going to do is call the location service that Angular exposes and set the path equal to where we want to end up. In this case, we're going to create a detail route. We're going to say go to speaker, and then we're going to pass in the speaker ID. Now this route doesn't exist yet. We're going to have to create it. And we have another issue here. This location service is something that is not available in this controller. So we have to inject that into the controller. And the way we do that is up top. And I like to put all of my services from Angular up front first. You know it's an Angular service because it has $, and then I alphabetize them. And then because that's first, it has to be the first parameter in the list to the controller. So now those two match. Next, we have to go add that route that we just created. And the name of that route was speaker. So go into the config.route. That's where we set them all up. And towards the bottom, we had defined a few already. We'll put it next to the speakers route. Now it's going to be speaker. Well, we have to pass something in. So here we're going to use a parameter. So we say :ID, and that's going to represent the speaker's ID that we passed in. And we did that back here in the code by passing in speaker ID. So back in the config route, that's going to be our URL. And then we're going to have a title, and that's going to be speaker. The template URL is going to be the view that we just created. And that's going to be speaker detail. It's going to be located in the same folder as our speaker features. We don't have any settings for this one because this is going to be a detail screen. It's not going to be accessible in the main menu. And we were using that to tell it the order of the navigation position on the menu and then what content to show in the menu. So we don't really need that. And one of the most important parts to do, and quite simply the easiest thing to forget, is to go inside of index.html, scroll down to the bottom, and make sure that we have our speaker detail.js in this page. Easy way to do that is to drag it over. I like to keep them together with other similar features. So we'll put speaker detail.js right below speakers. And then we should be able to save this. So now when we start on the speakers HTML, it's going to call into speakers.js to this go to speaker. We click on one of those, and then it's going to load up the speakers HTML. And because we have this basic controller in place, it'll activate it, turn off the spinner, and show us the title. And when this screen loads up, we got to make sure we call the activate method. And then it'll call common activate controller, which will turn off the spinner for us. Well, let's test this out. Here we've got our dashboard. We'll go to the speakers and let's select Aaron. We go from there, and now we made it all the way to the other page. Now it's great that we managed to go from speakers over to speaker detail, but we want to make sure that speaker ID came along. And that's the value right there. So how do we know that the value came to our route and then went on to the speaker details? Well, first we need to know what the name of that parameter is. So if we go back to config route, you can see down here on line 74, we can see that it's named ID. So back in the speaker details, we want to be able to access that property. So how do we get to that? Well, we use that through an Angular service called route params. And so we say $route params. We'll inject that in and we'll put it right before common. And those match up here. Then next, let's just grab the value quickly and we'll put it into something we can bind to. So we'll say speaker ID parameter. And then we'll set that to route params.id. Now, just for grins, let's go ahead and take this and bind it into our page. So here's our HTML. Instead of putting title on there, we'll just say there's a speaker ID parameter. We'll put some text before it to say speaker ID equals, just so we can see it in action. So now, this is going to come in, it's going to set that value from the route parameter, and we run it, we should see it on the page. So now we'll choose a speaker. This time we'll choose Elijah Manor, good friend of mine. When we click on it, we see speaker ID 21. It also matches with the route up top. Just to prove we're getting different IDs, let's choose somebody else. How about Fritz Onion? And he's got 16. So now we can see the IDs passing through, which means we can then use that to go and hit our repository to get all the information for that speaker. Let's do that next. Well, showing a single speaker ID is not the ideal situation. We want to show speaker information. So it's time to put some HTML in here. The first thing we're going to do is go look at what we did in speakers HTML because we had headers in here. We wrapped everything inside this container fluid. So we'll take that and put it inside here. Now, we have a widget violet in this one. We'll pick a different color for this page just so we don't go crazy trying to keep up with what colors are where. So let's choose green. Next, we want to have a header inside of our widget. Now, back inside the speakers HTML, we did have a header here. So we'll copy that div. We'll pull it down inside of that green header. We'll want to change this. So we'll set that equal to the title of the page, which we're going to make a function because we want to be able to set the title dynamically. For example, we may want to say the title be edit John Papa or edit Colleen Papa, whatever the speaker's name happens to be. And then we don't have a subtitle for this page, so we'll just get rid of that. So when we're done so far, we just got a header inside of our green widget. Next, we need some kind of a container to wrap all of our HTML input elements. So you can see down here what we did was use a widget content user, and then we just put everything inside of there. So that'll be all we need the speakers HTML for, because quite frankly, that's going to be very different when we're done. So we wrap that inside the div, and then inside of here, this is where all of our input elements are going to be. And I'm going to wrap these inside of a div, and then the first one I'm going to put in here is going to be separated out to be a label for the first name. And then we'll have an input box. We want to do two-way binding here, so we don't simply want to use the curly braces like that. Instead, we're going to use two-way binding. So we use ng model, and we're going to set this to VM, because that's going to be our controller's view model. And then we're going to set it to the speaker object, which we're going to have to create. And then he's going to have a first name property, and we'll use camel case there. So that'll be the object that comes across to us, and we'll use Breeze in our repositories to get that. And just to be nice citizens, we'll set a placeholder. We'll let people know this is where the first name goes. So now we've got the template in place for all of our fields. So let's go ahead and repeat this for all the different types. And then for image, we'll get something a little bit different here. We're going to use that same directive we created before for CC image person, and we're going to set that to speaker image source. And we'll set it to a class of image Polaroid. And we'll fix our HTML. And then finally, we're going to grab an additional piece of information which we haven't gotten before, which is the biography for the speaker. We didn't get that on the speaker list because this could be a very long text field. So now we're going to get it because we want all the information. We want to make it editable, so we choose to put it in a text area. And we're going to have to make sure that we go get this additional information. Now that we have the view ready to get our information displayed on the screen, now we have to make sure we know how to go get it from our repositories. But before we wire up that code to go get the data from our repositories, this is a nice checkpoint to see if our app still runs. We won't have any data on the screen, but we should end up seeing when we go from speakers over to a specific speaker, like Colleen, all the input fields laid out. So our next step is to fill all these in. Now it's time for our controller to go get the data for the speaker so we can show it on the screen. So let's create a method down here, and we'll call it getRequestedSpeaker. And this method is going to grab that route parameter ID. So let's do that right here. And then the way I like to code is basically refactor as I go. I know I'm going to have to talk to the data context because that's the jumping off point for all of my repositories. And I'm going to want to talk to a repository called speaker. We created that in the last module. And now we're going to want to use a method, and it doesn't exist yet, but I want to call it getById. So I want to get the speaker by ID, and I'm going to, of course, pass the value. And then when I'm done, I'm going to call then, because it's going to return a promise. And once I get back that information, it's going to execute a function. It'll be an anonymous function which sends back our data. We'll take that data and set it to a property here called vm.speaker. And if things don't go so well, on the other side of the then, we'll have a function here, which will be the error condition. And for this one, let's call a function that's going to be called logError. And we'll just put a message in like unable to get the speaker. And we'll put the val at the end of it. So we have a couple of things we have to fix up in here. First, we don't have anything called logError, so we probably want to create that. Well, luckily, we do have something that will help us out. So let's create a local variable called logError, and we'll use it as a shortcut. If you remember, over in our common module, we happen to have a logger utility, and we can call the getLog function. We're going to pass it the controller ID, which it uses in the logger to tell us like a stack trace of where we came from, and the type we want is the error function. Well, once again, we got to make sure that we have the common, which we do. It's right here as a dependency, so we're set to go. So now our logging should work, and of course we've got this guy down here. He says, I don't know what a data context is. You need to tell me. So back up top, we'll go ahead and put the data context in and inject that. All right, so now we've got this function laid out, and it's going to go get the data. Of course, we have to do here, we actually have to write the getById function. And then we have another to do, which we'll finish right now, which is nobody's calling this method. So when do we call it? Well, during Activate, we want to call that, and we want it to wait for the promise to return the data before it actually turns off the spinner. So we're going to call that inside the array. Remember, when we called the getSpeakerById, we also return it and set the data back to a speaker property. Well, we don't have that yet, so I'll put that up here. And by default, the speaker is going to be undefined because we don't have one until we go get it. And then back in our HTML, for the title inside the widget, we wanted to call this getTitle function. So to do that, we want to expose that up top. So now we have something to bind to. We'll call a local function called getTitle. So I'll put that down here. So what's getTitle going to do? Well, if somebody's editing something, I want it to say edit. And then I want to put in the speaker full name. It's always a good idea to put guard logic in place. So what if we don't have a speaker? Like the first time we come in, it's set to undefined, so full name won't exist. So we'll actually set it like this and say edit, and we're going to say if there's a speaker, return the full name. And what if speaker doesn't exist? Well, we could be a little safer again here and just say, well, return nothing in that case. And we'll just wrap this all up inside of parentheses. So the next step, of course, is to go and write our getById function. This is a good place for us to stop for a moment and really examine what we're trying to accomplish. We just laid out all the input fields on the speaker details, but now we're going to go and fill in all those input fields. And you might be wondering, well, wait a minute, don't we already know all the names of the speakers and have their images? We do on the speakers list, but we don't have all the information for a speaker. For example, their biography. Up till now, what we've been doing for the speakers list page is getting just their first name, last name, and their image and bringing that across the wire. We've been calling that a speaker partial. But now, to edit an individual speaker, we want to get all their information. Well, let's imagine we had 1,000 people, for example, on the attendees screen, and we wanted to go get a list of the attendees. It's a lot faster just to get their first name, last name, and the URL to their image than it is to go out and get 1,000 people and all their data. That'd be a lot of bandwidth to consume. So what we've done is said, just get the first name, last name, and their image, and then when I need to see the details for a specific speaker, like Brad Green here, I'll go get all the other information that I need and pull it into cache so Breeze knows about it. So our next task is to go get the data by ID, bring it back for that speaker, including all of its information, such as the biography and the email and the Twitter, and then merge that in with our existing cache of speakers. And what's going to enable this scenario so easily for us is going to be that we have the repository structure and Breeze to do it. Now there's lots of ways to accomplish this, but what's really going to make this easy for us is the fact that we have the repository pattern in place and Breeze, which will help us cache and merge the data. So let's go do that now. So our next step is to go write the getById function. And first, let's clean out the old title property, because we didn't need that, because we have the getTitle right here. And now let's go inside of the repositories and create getById. Now you might be thinking we're going to go inside the speaker repository, and that's a good guess, and normally that would be right. But in this case, it's wrong. Actually, the reason it's wrong is because first, we're going to go to the repository abstract. And that's going to be the place that we go and put the getById function. Why? Because getById is something that's really, really common. We could get any entity by ID. So let's put that inside of here. So we'll copy down this guy, and really what we're going to do is say, instead of get all local there, we'll say getById. And we'll create a local function that does that. So let's scroll down here, and we'll stick the function right in place. Well, what are we going to pass in? Well, we're going to pass in the ID, right? Well, yes, but we're also going to pass more information in. Because this is generic, and the abstract repository doesn't know which entity it's going to hit, we're going to pass in the entity name. So if we want to get speakers, or we want to get sessions, or we want to get attendees, we can tell it. And because sometimes we actually want to force it to go remote and not look local, we'll also pass in an optional flag for force remote. If that's true, we'll make sure it hits the server. And that's important because if we already have the entity, we don't want to hit the server unless being forced to do so. For example, if I go back and forth between the speaker details for John Papa, I don't need to go back to the server to get it. I've already got it in cache, so I won't force remote in that case. So first things first, inside of getById, let's go ahead and grab a reference to this. We'll store it in self. That's going to help us out so we don't get lost in the this shuffle. And then we'll set the manager equal to self manager. Well, what's that thing? Well, the self manager is going to be the manager that is on the object itself for the repository. We use that in other places here, just like down here. The manager is Breeze's way of talking to the back end or the local cache. And now we'll write some pseudocode to first say, well, we want to check the cache first. If we've got that data, then we're just going to use it. But before we even do that, we don't even want to bother if we're forcing it to go remote. So if we're not forcing it to go remote, we'll check the cache. So now we can use Breeze's features to find out if it has the entity. So we'll use a feature on it on the manager object called getEntityByKey. And how do we know the key? Well, the key is actually a combination of what's the entity's name and the ID, which we just happen to have passed in right up here. So if Breeze has that entity, it'll return it. If not, well, we have to check that. So we'll say if we have an entity, and if that entity is not partial. So what's this is partial? Well, if you remember, the is partial is the way we were tracking through the get partials to find out if we had a full entity or not. A partial entity would not have the biography, for example, for the speaker. Well, we don't have such a property yet, so let's mark a to do here. Let's go ahead and we're going to put on the is partial property. We'll do that in just a moment. So in this case, we have the entity, and it's not an isPartial. It's a full blown on entity, which means we have the biography and everything. In this case, we're going to log out a message saying, yeah, we got it, man. And we'll make the message just say, boom, we've got this entity, and that's the ID from cache, and then we'll pass the entity to the console, and we'll show it up in a toast. Now, for some reason, we have deleted this entity, and Breeze is aware of this. We want to make sure we don't return back that entity, because Breeze will do what's basically called a soft delete, and it will mark the entity for deletion, but not actually remove it yet. And when we get to the deleting module next, we'll need that because it's really important. So for now, let's put some guard logic in place to say if the entity, which has an entity aspect property that comes from Breeze, and it's got a state on the entity, if it's marked as deleted, go ahead and set the entity to null. That's going to make sure that we hide that and don't return an entity somebody already tried to delete. And so far, all this has been synchronous. So we want to make sure that we can actually return a promise back. So to do that, when we get this entity, we're going to say use Q, and it's got this when function, and when's going to basically return a promise for us, and we're going to pass back the entity that we cached. So in the event we weren't trying to go remotely and forcing it that way, and we happen to have an entity that was not a partial entity, we're going to return that in a promise. But what if we don't have that entity? Or what if we are forcing remote? Then we're going to have to hit the server. So here, we'll use a feature inside of Breeze to make sure we can go and hit the server for us, because if it's not in cache, we're going to query it. So in this case, we're going to return the manager. Again, it's the Breeze manager, and it's got this function called fetch entity by key, which is similar to the get entity by key. So up here, we did get entity by key, and that's going to look in the local cache. Down here, we're going to use fetch entity by key, which is going to hit the server. And we're going to pass in the entity name and the ID, same things we needed before. Breeze is going to go off back to the server and return a promise to us. So we can then say to $Q, and then we're going to call a query succeeded function, and that's where we're going to handle the data that came back. And then when it doesn't work, well, if it doesn't work, let's be positive here, we're going to call self query failed. Now, what is this self query failed? Well, that's going to be that generic query failed that we have inside the repository. So down here in repository abstract, we had query failed right down there. So if the query fails, we'll pass in the error. It'll format a message using this config app error prefix. That's going to be like the name code camper. We set that in the config.js. And because we're using config, let's make sure we actually have the end dependencies up at the top of the page. And oops, we do not. We didn't get in trouble before because we had not used it yet. But now let's go ahead and put that in place. And down here, we'll put it in the parameter list. So now let's go back down to the get by ID. And of course, we need to wire up query succeeded. So let's create a function down here for query succeeded. And it's going to pass back to us the data that it got from the server, which should be the speaker. So first things first, let's go ahead and set the entity equal to data.entity. Entity is our local variable here. And then data is what's coming back. It's a response from the server. And it's got a property called entity, which should have the speaker in it. Now, let's go ahead and set the entity isPartial to false. This is that property that we have to go create. Remember that to-do up on line 60? Well, that's where we marked down that we had to go get the isPartial, and we have to set that on the object itself. So first, we're going to set it here. We probably also want to make sure that we actually got an entity back, so let's do that now. So if we have an entity, we'll put that before we do anything else. In this case, we'll type in a message saying we didn't get that entity. So here we're saying we could not find the entity name and the ID, and then there's no data, so that's null, and the last parameter true is going to show a toast. And then after that, we want to get out. And if it did work and we got an entity back, we'll set the isPartial to false, because that's going to mean it's a full-blown entity, meaning it has all of the properties. And in that case, let's also log out a message saying we've retrieved the entity, this is the ID, move this to the next line. From the remote data source, that's the entity object. We'll log out to the console and again show a toast. Finally, we need to return back the entity. That's kind of an important step. Well, now we've got this method. Let's go ahead and expose it. So here's our get by ID on the repository abstract. It's right up here. And we have a to-do down here, which we still have to clean up. And that to-do is going to make sure we put that property on the model. So let's do that now. We'll delete the to-do. And the place to do this is going to be off in the model.js. So if we come down, a speaker is a person, we've already got an extension to the model, and we'll add in the isPartial property. And by default, we'll set this to false. So that means every time we get a person, it's going to set isPartial to false, which means it's a full-blown guy. So this changes some of our logic a little bit. We now need to be able to set isPartial to true every time we call the getPartials method. So let's go ahead and put that inside a repository abstract. We're going to create a generic function that can be shared by attendees and speaker repositories because both of those get people or persons. And this function is going to be called setPartialIsTrue. And we'll pass in the entities that we want to set it for. And we'll just use a simple for loop. We'll set each entity in that array's isPartial property to true. And we're done, we'll return the entities. So basically just going to modify the entities that came in and return them all back with their property set to true. So who's going to call that guy? Well, first we have to expose him. So let's go back up to the top up here, and we'll put it on the prototype of the repository abstract. So right now we've done two really important things that we've exposed. First, we exposed this getById right there. That's going to be called by our speakers. And then we also expose this setPartialIsTrue. That's going to be called by two repositories, speakers and attendees. And the reason we put these in the repository abstract is because we wanted them to be shared features. So let's first go into the repository for the speaker, because that's what we're trying to do by getting its ID. And we do want to add a property to this, so we can say getById. We'll call a local function called getById. And what's that going to do for us? Well, down here, we're going to add a new function. It's going to be local. It's going to be called getById. We're going to pass in the ID for it. And now we'll execute the repository abstract's getById function. And we can't just pass the ID, and we've got to pass the entity name, which happens to be something we have locally here. And we'll pass in the ID and then force remote. So when we call getById, we're always going to pass the ID in like 12. We may or may not pass in force remote. And if we don't, if we leave it off, then we're just basically saying, yeah, don't force remote. So this effectively becomes a pass-through. Now, why do we bother doing that? Why not just call Redon repository abstract? Well, this is a pattern. And the pattern we're using says that inside of speaker details, I always want to go through a real repository, like speaker. So I'll go data context speaker.getById. We'll pass in the value. And then that is going to call up into repository speaker, which is then going to call into the repository abstract using these parameters. And don't forget to put in the return statements as well. That's super important, so we make sure we return back to promise. So we wired up the getByIds, but we still have to finish up the setPartialsIsTrue. There's two places we have to do that. One of those is inside of the getPartials function, right here inside the speaker. So we already said down here we want to set isSpeaker to true for every speaker that we get back. So now let's copy that. And we'll say speakers instead of isSpeaker, we'll say isPartial. And because we're already looping through these, we're not going to take advantage of the setIsPartial function that we had down in the abstract repository, but we will use that in repository attendee. For this one, we'll go find the getAll function, and then when it returns back the data, first thing we'll do is call into that function we just created. And that's going to be the setIsPartialIsTrue. What are we going to do it to? We'll do it to the results that come out of the query succeeded. And then we'll capture those in a local variable. That's going to be the attendees that comes out. So the data results are the attendees. They're going to get all their isPartials set to true. And then we're going to capture that back into the attendees local variable, which means we also have to update down here where we're actually spitting out the data results. So let's do that now. Instead of saying data results.length, instead we'll say attendees. And the next step is to run through the code. So let's actually run it, and we should be getting back our data. So we open it up in the browser. We'll hit the F12 to open up the developer tools. We'll refresh just to clear the cache. And now let's go into a speaker, and we'll click on Aaron. And here we go. We've got our data. And if I change Aaron's name from Aaron to Joe, we can see it edits here and right up there. So we're seeing the data binding in two places. Now that we've got our data coming back for the editing screen, let's actually examine how this is actually working in the browser. So if we come down inside the developer tools and click on this little button down here and then highlight it to the top button, we'll see the developer tools flip to the bottom of the screen, and we're going to open the network tab up. Now let's go back to the main page on the dashboard, and we'll refresh entirely by hitting Control-R. It's going to clear the cache and refresh everything. Now what we want to see is all the data going across, so we're going to hit on the XHR. So here we can see all the HTML that came across and then the initial data. Let's examine the speakers for a moment. So here's the speakers, and as we scroll across, now we can see Craig Shoemaker and his first name, his last name, and his image source. And notice it ends right here. So that's all the information we get for each speaker. That's a speaker partial. What we really want is when we click on Craig Shoemaker, we want to get the full speaker information. So let's clear this out for a moment. And notice when we go over to the speakers page, we shouldn't be getting speakers again. We only get the HTML, no data because we already had it. So now let's find Craig Shoemaker. Luckily, he's right up here. And then let's click on this. We go to that new page, we got two pieces of information. One is the speaker detail, and the other is the person's information right there. So we had two pieces to get. We got the HTML, which of course is HTML, and then we got information just for Craig. So here it tells me the type is a person, and I got the ID, and then the first name and last name, which I had before. That's right there. But I didn't have all the other information. So now I've got his email, his blog, his Twitter, his gender, his favorite food, everything else we might want to get. Now Breeze is caching that information for us, so now let's clear this out for a moment and let's hit the back button. We go back, we didn't get HTML, and we didn't get JavaScript, and we didn't get data because all that was already here. Breeze cached our data for us. So now when I go back into Craig, it shouldn't be getting any new data, and it's actually not going to hit the remote server, it's going to run our local code route. Now we have a bug in our local code, so let's see that bug in action. First, we can see it tried to get the data from cache, and then it said queue is undefined. So this is one of the reasons I like to use Toastr in my logging because it shows me right away why I had an error. This is a lot easier to read, it's right in my face, as opposed to clicking on the console and trying to scroll through all the error messages that are in here. So now let's go find out why queue is not defined. So let's follow this through from the speaker details. Here, we called into the data context right there to call getById, and it calls into the speaker itself. So that's going to be the speaker repository. Let's go over to there, and we can see here's our getById function, which in turn is then going to call into the abstract repository's getById. We're going to pass the ID in. So we'll fall into the repository abstract, and here we can see our getById function, and then it's going to fall through, and we're trying to get it out of cache, so it's going to go through cache first, and then the error had to do with $Q when it was returning the entity. So there's a couple reasons this could happen. One of which could be that we did not inject it as a dependency, and $Q is a service that's exposed by Angular. So up top, we don't have that in here, and one way we could do this is to add it to the dependency list. But we do expose $Q through the common service, and I can show you that down here on line 36, we're actually using it. Right there, so we can make sure everybody's got easy access to $Q. So that means that all of our repositories could just say self $Q. Like that. That's one way we could accomplish this. Another way we could accomplish this is to actually set a shortcut variable right here inside the abstract repository. So we could just say, all right, well, we'll create this variable called $Q, and we're going to set that equal to common.$Q. Which way you want to go is really up to you. But now, if we go back to our application, now let's refresh from scratch, we shouldn't have that error anymore. So we'll move this down a little. We're on speakers. We'll look at the network tab. We'll clear this out. We'll go into Craig. There's Craig's data. We'll clear that just to make sure we can see everything clearly. We'll hit the back button. Nothing new here. That's great. We click on Craig this time. It should be getting it out of cache, which it is. Notice no network traffic whatsoever. Now if I hit back again, and let's say I go into Dan Wahlin, I click on that one, and now I am getting Dan's information. So once again, we'll clear that out. And on any subsequent call to Craig or to Dan, it's going to just basically get the cached item. So we'll go back into Dan, nothing there. But if you go to somebody new, like Brad, then it's going to get new information. So the value of using this is to show you that, look, I can get a whole list of speakers on the speakers page and not get a huge payload. So when I go to this page the first time, refreshing this, I can look at the size of the speaker data right there. It's 10K, not so big. And then only when I need it, when I go get a particular speaker, I can go get the information for that speaker. In this case, the data is really minimal. But in a large application, you could really see how this could be a huge performance improvement. In this module, we built up the editing screen for the speakers, and we showed how we can use two-way data binding with the ngModel directive and bind that to the HTML inputs. We took advantage of the routing module and its routing parameters with the route param service, so we could pass the parameters of which speaker we're editing from the list of speakers down to the speaker editing details. And finally, we wrapped up by showing how we can use the repository pattern and some caching strategies to query both locally and remote, and really hide that from the controller, make the data context and repositories do that work. Next up, we're going to hit on saving and canceling and change detection.